All right, so a couple of weeks ago, this guy named Tyler Weatherly was up here preaching a message, and he reminded us that we are all really close to dying. Yeah, thanks, Tyler. He's outside with the kids right now, so we can't really rouse. You can rouse him later. He gave us this chart, and it was like, here's all the weeks you have left to live. And we were all like, oh my goodness, we're about to die. So, thank him when you see him. For me, I started thinking, okay, I only got this little block of weeks to live left. Man, what's on my bucket list? I got to get a move on. I got to get this thing done. So I started thinking about what's on my bucket list. And that's my first question for you today. What is on your bucket list? Let's play that video there. Maybe you got some skydiving to do on your bucket list. Anybody got skydiving? Like that's for sure on there. Or maybe you want to skydive, but you're scared, so you can do it indoors. That's the way to go. Think how amazing that would be, like free falling out of an airplane, seeing the whole world, you're plummeting to your apparent death. Yeah, I'm never doing that. That's not on my bucket list. Or maybe you just want to travel. Anybody want to travel? Just like go for a month or 2 months or a year and just travel around the world, seeing all kinds of amazing stuff. Yeah, I don't really care about that either. That's not on my bucket list. Or maybe there's some other things. Maybe you want to see some great place. It's not just traveling, but you want to see Europe. I got any Europe? I want to travel Europe. Takers. Or maybe the Grand Canyon. Or some other famous thing you want to see. Or maybe you've got some life milestones left on your bucket list. Like maybe you want to fall in love. Maybe that hasn't happened to you yet. You really want that to happen before you die. Or maybe you want to, fall in love, get married, have kids. Anybody on that want to have that happen before they die? Nobody? Yeah, I already did all that stuff, so that's not on my bucket list either. So none of this stuff is on my bucket list. I just get rid of all of it. So 2 observations about bucket lists. Number 1, bucket lists are a really weird thing. Oh yeah, this is a campfire on the beach. We're going to get to that soon. Bucket lists are super weird. Have you ever thought about this? You have a list of things that you're not doing that if you only had a year left to live, then you would do them. So these are obviously things that you think are important. They're so important that you would just drop everything. If you had almost no time left, you would drop everything and go after them. But currently, you are not doing them. That's weird. That's like what we talked about last week. We were talking about the Apostle Paul. And we were talking about how in his younger days, he was just this man of action. Actually, his whole life, though his action changed. We'll see that today. In his younger years, whatever he thought was the way to go to follow God, he just ran after it full force. And it would be weird not to do that. See, God, even though he went the wrong way again and again, God could redirect him because he was an object in motion. But for most of us, we got this bucket list. Here's the stuff we really think is important, but we're not doing it. We are not objects in motion. Now, here's the other thing I want to leave you with about bucket lists, a question. How many people do you think there are in the world who, if they were suddenly told you only have a year left to live, for sure, maybe some doctor that they really trust told them you're going to die in a year, or maybe God sends an angel and says, look, you got 1 year, that's it. For sure you're going to die in a year. How many people would keep doing the thing they're already doing? Because they're already living their bucket list. We're going to see an example of that today. We're in a series right now called Build More Fires. It's really fun because we're looking at all the places in the Bible where there is a fire going on. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And those are really fun stories. And this right now, last week and this week, if you missed last week's message, you can go back and watch it online. We're in a little mini-series within that about Paul, who was an early follower of Jesus and started lots of churches, did amazing things. Like I said, we saw last week what he was like in his early years. At the end of last week, we saw a little bit of what he was like toward the end. You see, God, because he was this object in motion and he was taking action, whatever he thought was what God was calling him to do, he went after it, no excuses. Now, how often did he get it wrong? Like all the time, right? He got it wrong like all the time. But that was okay. Because he was moving after God, God was able to redirect him and use him. And so in his life, God put him through this sort of plan for growth, which involved a lot of suffering, a lot of hard stuff, but he was up for it. And God transformed him into a man whose fire wasn't burning just for his own desires anymore, but his fire was burning in line with the fire of God. His will was for the will of God. And we're going to see how he was. We have another vision today of the end of his life and how he was, how he viewed the world, and what he was able to accomplish, or really what God was able to accomplish while he sat there and did almost nothing. What God was able to accomplish through him because of the way, what he believed deep down, what his core identity had become. So, to start out, 2 points. If you're here on site, you've got notes, and the first 2 points are the same for each message in this series. Build more fires. The first point is this: build the fire. In order to grow and become like God, in order to have God's fire grow in us, which is the only thing that really matters in this life, we have to do things. God has done it all, but we still have to take action, just like we're talking about with Paul. So build the fire. And number 2, gather the people. Gather the people. So here at Community of Hope Church, our mission, the thing that we're all about, which is the thing that God is all about, is this. Here's how we say it. We are all about helping people grow in their relationship with God and with each other. We want to help people grow. And Paul understood that. Remember last week, as soon as he became a Christian, what did he do? He wanted to help other people get to know God, get to know Jesus. So he immediately ran out in the street like a crazy maniac and started screaming about Jesus and telling people how, their lives are going to be destroyed if they didn't turn and follow him. The Bible says he proved that Jesus was the Christ. And in those early days, how many people came to know Jesus through Paul? Zero. When he went screaming into the streets telling people about Jesus, everybody just hated his guts. Because the way that God draws people to himself is through relationship. Paul had zero relationship with these people. And so God had to change him. So when we talk about gather the people, this is what we want to do. It's important to remember in this series, the fire of God must first grow in us. It's his power that is going to draw other people to him, not us. We can't do it. It's totally impossible. We still have to do things, and we're going to see Paul does a little bit, but in a very different way, a very different mindset. Okay? So, first thing we're going to do this in kind of 3 parts. First, I'm going to read a psalm for you, Psalm 91. And Psalm 91 is a vision of just what we're going to see in Paul in the story we're going to look at today. Life closely connected with God. Life with the fire of God burning in you. We're going to read that psalm. Then we're going to read the story. We're going to tell the story and read part of it, which is going to come from the end of the book of Acts, which is about Paul having this bonfire on the beach. It's awesome. And then we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of people in that story and draw some conclusions. Okay? So first we'll start off with Psalm 91. This psalm is amazing. Are you familiar with Psalm 91? I've been kind of obsessed with this psalm lately. I've been reading it over and over again. Here we go. When it says he, remember that that's inclusive language in the Bible. The way that they wrote he meant he and she, okay? So, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. Does that say they'll be stressed in the shadow of the Almighty? No, they'll rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I choose to say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely he will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence, that's a disease. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. That's a wall, like a city wall. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence or disease that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. Now, this is a key verse for us today. You will only observe with your eyes, and you will see the punishment of the wicked, if you make the Most High your dwelling. Think about that language. What's a dwelling? A place where you live. You're going to make God the place where you live. Even the Lord, who is my refuge, then no harm will befall you. No disaster will come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because he loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. It's powerful. Like I said, I'm obsessed with it. Maybe the first time it might wash over your mind. You can't quite grasp it all. Go read it. Try reading it like 100 times this week and see what it does in your life. It'll do something amazing. Now, that's a vision. That's a vision of what it looks like to live in step with the fire of God. Now let's go look at another vision from the Apostle Paul in the end of the book of Acts. All right, so here's the background. Okay, remember we left him. God sent him off on this journey. He sent him into the desert. Paul, we got to change you. You're going to have to suffer a lot in order to be changed. And Paul was like, no, I'm too scared to suffer. No. He was like, yes, I'm in. Whatever it is, I'm in. And so God took him out to the desert for 3 years, and then Paul was a little bit less crazy, and he had a few of his rough edges knocked off. But he said, Paul, now you got to go live in your hometown. God sent him back home to live with his parents, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, which would have been really humiliating for him, I think. Then eventually some guy named Barnabas from the church shows up and he says, Paul, you're crazy, but I think God can still use you and make something out of you. Why don't you come with me? And so he and Barnabas end up going on all these trips together, and Paul takes all these missionary journeys around the Roman and Mediterranean world. He starts lots of churches. He changes slowly. If you read what he wrote and you watch what happens in Acts, you can see him change the way he is. He's still just as intense as he was when he was a young man. But now he becomes humble, and he becomes a man of love, and he becomes a man who's not trying to make things happen, but who is following the lead of God. He's no longer trying to lead his own life and saying, God, please be with me in this. Now it's almost like he's walking through life watching for what God is going to do. And we're going to see that in the story today. So what happens then is when we get toward the end of his life, after the part that we read in Acts chapter 20 last week, we read he said farewell to one of the churches he'd spent a lot of time with, a church in a city called Ephesus. He said goodbye to them. I'm never going to see you again. Why was he never going to see them again? Because in this time, God began to make clear to him that he only had a short time left to live. Just like sometimes happens, well, at least imaginarily with our bucket lists, right? God made clear to him he only had a short time left to live. He said, Paul, you're going to go to Jerusalem. Go back to the place where everybody's against you. And when you get there, they're still going to be against you. In fact, they're going to fight against you. They're going to try to kill you. You're going to be arrested. And then you're going to be taken eventually to the city of Rome where you're going to stand trial. But your life is nearing its end. Now, how did he know this? How did God communicate it to him? I think lots of ways. God communicated to him in his times of prayer. God communicated to him through the Bible as he was reading it. Different verses stood out to him in different ways. God communicated to Paul also through people who were in the churches that he went to visit. For a period of time, every church that he was going to, as he moved toward Jerusalem, there'd be somebody in the church who showed up and said, I feel like God is telling me that you're going to get arrested. You're going to go to Jerusalem and you're going to be arrested there and you might even be killed. I think that's what God is saying to me. And at one point, there's this great story where Paul runs into a guy who was just as crazy as he was in his early days, right? This guy runs up to Paul and he grabs Paul's belt and takes it off. Guys, how would you feel if somebody after church runs up and unbuckles your belt and whips it off? I don't know, you might just deck them. But Paul's just like, oh, I trust God. God's going to do something with this belt. So the guy takes the belt and he wraps up his hands and his legs with the belt, ties himself up with it. And he says, God is saying that if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be tied up just like this. And the guy's point is, so Paul, obviously, don't go to Jerusalem. And this is one of the few points in the end of Paul's life where you see him get mad. He actually gets all intense at this guy. And he goes, you're hearing from God, but you don't understand at all. You don't understand at all. You're trying to tell me not to go to Jerusalem? I am ready not just to be arrested, I'm ready to die. If that's the will of God, that is the best possible thing. And the guy's like, whoa, okay. And Paul's like, so thanks for the info. I already knew that. And I'm still going. See you later. So he takes off, he goes to Jerusalem. What happens in Jerusalem? Exactly what all these people told him, right? There's like people trying to kill him left and right. There's this group of Jewish people who actually make a vow that they're not going to eat or drink until they've murdered Paul. They didn't end up being able to murder him, so I don't know what happened afterwards. I guess they all starved to death. So he eventually gets arrested. The Romans kind of save him from people who are trying to kill him. And he ends up on trial in the capital of the province in front of like this Roman governor and this king guy, right? And so he's preaching to them. And what happens then is you can see here part of how Paul is doing things, but in response to God. Remember, one of the things that God has made clear to him by this point is that he needs to go to Rome. He's going to go to Rome and he's going to stand trial before the emperor before he dies. Before this guy who thinks he's the king of the world. He's going to tell him, actually, no, it's not you, it's Jesus. And then he's going to die. That'll be the end. So he's on trial before these kings who are under the authority of Rome, and he does something when he realizes that they're going to keep him there for a long time, or maybe even set him free. He does something called appealing to Caesar. Now, this was something that a Roman citizen had the right to do in those days. It's kind of like appealing to a higher court. And so he appealed to Caesar, and what that meant is, even though these guys were a governor and a king, they could no longer keep him. They had to send him to Rome, even if they wanted to release him. He did something to make sure that what God had already told him needed to happen, happened. You see how he's watching what God is doing? He's following God's lead. What happens next is he's given to this centurion and he's put on a boat with a whole bunch of prisoners, like a lot of prisoners. Pretty big boat. It's got like 267 people, not like 267 people. It's got 267 people exactly on this boat. I don't know what the breakdown was. Some of them were prisoners. Some of them were the crew of the boat. And some of them were soldiers under the command of this centurion who was the captain, the commander of this group, right? And they're taking him back to Rome. Well, on this trip, they encounter a whole bunch of storms. And part of what we're going to talk about today is how did they each view the storms, these different groups of people. So they encounter these storms, and when they do, first there's a big storm and they're stuck. It takes them longer to get where they're going. And during this time, Paul is receiving information from God, and he keeps telling the leaders, okay, God is telling me that if we go on, if we try to push past and don't stay where we're at for the winter, the whole ship is going to be destroyed. But nobody listens to him. They push on anyway. And then again, he tells them, finally they do listen to him in the end, because everything that he says comes true. And in the end game of this story is that they're lost at sea in a storm. And he says, don't worry, it's going to be okay. The ship's going to be destroyed and everything in it because you didn't listen to God. But if you listen now, every human being on board is going to be saved. They're not going to die. And so they finally listen to Paul. They beach the ship. They end up on this island in the Mediterranean. They don't know where they are. They're all kind of scared, except for Paul, who doesn't even see, not only does he not seem scared, he doesn't even seem to see the things that are scary. They end up beached on this island. What island was it? We don't really know. I'm going to read this section for you. It's going to say the island of Malta. Probably not. The original text says a word that's kind of like Malta, but not actually Malta. And there's some debate about what island this was, because as you're going to see, there's a snake on this island. And apparently there's no snakes on Malta. I don't really know. Has anybody ever been to Malta? No? Yeah, me neither. Okay, so let's read this, and then we'll draw some conclusions about the different people. So once they were safely on shore, we found that the island was called Malta, or maybe not. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood. He's doing manual labor, just like the prisoners. He is a prisoner. And as he put it into the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. And Paul freaked out and said, this is the worst thing in the world. No. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, this man must be a murderer. Because even though he escaped from the sea, justice, that is, they're talking about a god named Justice, has not allowed him to live. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, because that's what happens when you get bit by a viper. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Okay, logical conclusion. So Paul takes off after they start calling him a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us into his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, he placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies that we needed. All right, now this is an amazing story, the story of a beach bonfire in the Bible. What we're going to do is look at the three, I'm going to categorize them as three groups of people that are in this story, the story of the storms and the ship leading up to it, and then what happens on the island. And we're going to look at how these three different groups of people were viewing reality. What they believe about reality is the key. It changes everything about how they see the problems that come into their lives and really even the world that they're walking around in. This story is challenging to me because Paul in this story, it's like he's walking in a different world than everybody else. Everybody else is freaking out for good reasons. Like if you're about to die, if you're about to be drowned in the ocean, should you freak out? I mean, most people would say, yeah, you should be stressed about that so that you do something to fix your problem. Paul is just chilling, man. He's fine. So why? How is Paul walking around in a different world? So let's look first at the prisoners, and then we're going to take a look at the workers, by which I mean the soldiers and the crew, and then we'll look at Paul himself, and we'll see the centurion is kind of this man in transition that's sort of having his eyes opened at the moment to what's going on. All right, so let's start off with the prisoners. How did these prisoners on the ship view the world and life? It doesn't say, but we can't imagine. These are people who have stolen things, who have committed crimes, who've maybe murdered people. They're all being taken to Rome to maybe be put on trial or maybe serve as slaves in Rome because of the bad things that they had done. So what kind of mentality do those things come out of? Well, you can imagine that most of these prisoners probably had what we would call a victim mentality. Life, what is life? Life is a bunch of bad stuff that happens to me even though I don't deserve it. That's what life is. I try my best, and bad things keep happening to me for no good reason. And life, really, all that there is in life is just, I kind of try to get whatever I can for myself and run with it, because that's all you can do in this life. And that's how they end up in the place of stealing things, and murdering people, right? And so if you're in that mindset, how would these prisoners have viewed the events that happened on the ship and on the beach? You can imagine them in the ship, right? Okay, great, now we're under arrest, we're being taken to Rome. Just one more awful thing that's happened in my awful life. Nothing good ever happens to me. I don't deserve this. And then they run into a storm. Oh, great, even worse. Now we're going to drown in the ocean. Man, typical. That's typical. Life is terrible. What, is there a God in this life? I don't know, but if there is, He doesn't care about me. You can never know if there really is a God or not. I had someone say that to me this week. You can never know if there really is a God or not. That's just a justification for the things that they felt like they had to do, the things that they wanted to do. So these prisoners, because of what they believe about the world, view the problems that come in a particular way. Okay, we escaped the storm. Okay, but what awful thing is going to come next? That's just what life does to me. Poor me. Oh, now we're going to be beached. The Roman centurions are probably going to kill us all so we don't escape. Great. Oh, now we got our lives saved by Paul. Oh, well, we're probably going to be eaten by the islanders now. They're probably a bunch of cannibals. We don't even know where we are. Oh, now they made us a bonfire and they're doing all kinds of good stuff for us. Oh, yeah, but how long is that going to last? Oh, look, now there's a viper eating Paul's hand. Yep, the island's full of snakes. We're all going to die. And even if we get out of here, they're just going to take us to Rome and make us slaves, and we're going to die there. Life sucks. If I have a chance to grab, a bagel from one of these Romans, I don't think they had bagels, but I kind of want a bagel right now. If I had a chance to grab a bagel and just run, I would just grab whatever I can and go. That's the victim mentality of the prisoners. Now let's look at the workers for a minute, the soldiers and the crew of this ship. What is their mentality? Now these are people very different from the prisoners. These are people much like most of the people that we know, actually. These are people who have jobs, actually good jobs, and they are working hard to succeed at life. For them, life is about, we work hard, we overcome problems, we are creative, we endure, we press through, and we succeed in the end. That's what life is. Now, do they believe in God? Yeah, most of them do. But for them, God is not someone who's present in their lives doing things all the time. Yeah, He's up there. He made the world. That's good. But when I have a problem, I got to deal with it. That's the main thing in life. Let me ask you this. Is that mentality, is it good or bad? Not going to give you the answer. It's a lot better than the prisoners. Now, with that mentality, how do they view what happens in this story? When the storms come up, they don't view it as just another bad thing that happens in their bad life. They view the storm as a problem to be overcome. A problem to be overcome by human power. And so that's how they approach it. They view every problem that happens in the story that way. They attack it with their own strength. Now, so that's why when Paul comes to them and says, God is saying we shouldn't attack this problem right now. We should just wait it out. They cannot do that. They have to be hard at work overcoming their problems because that's who they are. I got to admit, this is, of the groups of people here, this is the group that I line up with most of the time. They are attacking this problem. The difficulty is that their human strength isn't enough to beat the problem. And as they attack it in every possible way they can, their ship sinks and everything they have is destroyed and they're about to die. And finally, in that moment, they're willing to listen to Paul and do what he says. Now let's take a look at Paul, our third and final category. The centurion is starting to become a little bit more like him, but it's like Paul is in a whole nother world than these people. How does Paul view life? What's at the core? What is life to him? You can see it throughout the book of Acts. You can see it throughout this story. This is going to be your third point for your notes today if you're here on site. The way that Paul views life, life is about knowing the person in control. Life is not about, it's just this awful stuff that happens to me all the time and I do whatever I can to get by. Life is not about, I work hard and succeed, though Paul does work hard and he does succeed. Life is about knowing the person who is in control. And you can see that that changes everything for him. When problems come into his life, he doesn't even see them as problems. The rest of the people around him, I think at the beginning they think he's crazy, and then by the end they think he's a god. You saw that, right? Because the problems, it's like they just flow off of him like they weren't even there. When a storm comes and his boat is about to sink and they're all about to die, to him that's not a problem. It's just this God who I know, who actually talks to me and I talk to him all the time, and who is in control of everything, well, he's redirecting us right now. If I know I'm supposed to go to Rome, so I know I'm going to get there, if there's a storm coming right now, that means there must be somewhere else for me to go before I get to Rome. That's all it means. He's also not trying to control the situation. He doesn't run up and try and force the leaders to do what God is saying. When he goes to the leaders and he says, hey, here's what God says. If we go this way, our ship's going to get destroyed. The leaders say, no way, we're not listening to you. He says, all right, that's cool. God's still in control. He is not leading his own life. Just like we saw in Psalm 91, it says, you will observe with your eyes. It's almost like Paul is walking around in this God-infused world, watching God save people and do amazing things. He's just along for the ride, trying to go wherever he sees God going. Does he do things? Yeah, a little bit. He does things a little bit, but only whatever he sees that would be helpful or that he thinks God might want him to do in that situation. So you see, when he gets on the island, what's the first thing he does? He's not scared of the islanders. He's not afraid of this island where he knows no one, that they're going to come and kill him. He's not surprised that God provides a bonfire for them. Then he's also not surprised when a snake jumps out and bites him. And this is the part that's so challenging to me. How many of us are at the place in our following of Jesus where we are that deep that our instinctive reaction is trust in God? A viper jumps out of a fire and latches onto his hand, and he hardly bats an eye. He shakes it off into the fire and goes, oh, that's cool, whatever. God's leading me in my life. A viper. You see him on the beach, he's simply doing whatever he can to help. The viper attacks him while he is throwing brush onto the fire. He's just helping the prisoners and the islanders build a better fire. When the people call him a god, he takes off to a different place and goes to help the governor of the island. Just going to hang out with him, sees somebody who's sick and in need, asks if he can pray for him. Prays for him. The guy gets healed by God. Amazing. Does Paul celebrate and he's so shocked that this guy got healed? This is normal life at this point for Paul. I mean, sure, he's happy that the guy was healed, but this is not unusual in his life. God healed another guy in front of me. I didn't do it. Bunch more people come. He prays for them. God heals them. By the time we get to the end of the story, did you follow? Basically what's happened is the whole island have become Christians. Imagine what this must be like for the centurion and his soldiers. Like, what in the world is going on? We've got this guy as a prisoner in our cargo underneath in the ship, but who is he? He just walks around. What did he even do? Imagine this centurion trying to report to his commanders back home what happened. So what did this guy, Paul, what did he do? Well, kind of nothing. He just sat in his room and prayed a little bit, and then he built a fire, and then after that, he just prayed for some people. And what happened? The whole island changed. Who changed it? God. God's fire. The last thing that I want to observe today about Paul is this, and this will be the fourth point for your notes today. The theme of Paul's life is God's fire, not Paul's problems. The theme of his life is God's passion, God's will, where God is going. The theme of his life is not his own problems. You see that that's true for both the other categories of people. The prisoners, the theme of their life is my problems, and they're just depressed about it and will take whatever they can get. The workers, who are like most good people, the theme of their life is still their problems. I've got to overcome this problem. I've got to work hard through it and succeed. But Paul is not even thinking about the problems. He's thinking about God. That's the key. I'm not yelling at you. I'm yelling at my own self. Like, knock it off. I've been a Christian for 20 years. I should be further along than I am right now. Stop focusing on your problems, Isaac, and focus on God. He knew that problem was going to come all along. And if you just focus on Him, Jesus has made a way into a whole new life. And here we see Paul living it. Took him 30 years. Took God 30 years to work all that into him. But because during those 30 years, he was willing to say, God, I'm going to do whatever you ask me to do, whatever I think you're calling me to do, I'll run after it. God was able to make him into a person like this. Do you want to be a person like this? It's people like this that are able to gather people to God because they're not the ones doing it. God's the one doing it. Paul hardly does a thing. Build the fire, gather the people. Let's pray.